Could the entire world actually be reached with just one single repeating action? Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a truly fascinating global thought experiment. And to be clear, we aren't looking at this through the lens of theology or philosophy today. No, we're looking at this purely through the lens of mathematics and strategic modeling. We're going to explore the profound, almost unbelievable difference between simple addition and geometric multiplication when you apply it to human behavior on a massive planetary scale. It's a fundamental shift in thinking, and honestly, it kind of changes everything we assume about global impact. Okay, let's dive into this massive hypothetical. What if every single Christian consistently helped just one person become a believer over time? We have to ask ourselves, could the entire world eventually be reached this way? And if so, how long would that actually take? Well, to answer that, we really need to leave our traditional assumptions at the door and strictly follow the numbers. We want to track the mathematical reality of what happens when a single, very simple action is multiplied by millions. To begin any mathematical model, we obviously need a firm starting point. So to ground ourselves objectively in the sheer scale of the planet, we're going to start with a world population of roughly 8.2 billion people. That is a staggering number, and it represents the ultimate target of this entire thought experiment. Now, for our strategic model, we're going to assume a starting network of 5%. That gives us an initial starting group of 410 million Christians. So 8.2 billion target, 410 million starting point. This is our mathematical foundation, the base from which all of our future growth is going to originate. But here's the thing, the global canvas doesn't just stand still, right? It shifts, it breathes, and it expands every single day. Just consider the daily reality of our planet's demographics for a second. On one side, you have approximately 175,000 deaths occurring daily, which represents roughly 0.002% of the world's population. But on the other side, an astounding 385,000 babies are born every single day. That's about 0.005%. So births are vastly, constantly outpacing deaths. The target we're looking at isn't some static number. It is a rapidly expanding, dynamic population that grows way faster than it shrinks. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is when we test the current addition-based assumption against this expanding reality. If we suppose that only 5% of those who die are entering heaven, a sample group of 1,000 individual deaths yields a really tiny fraction, just 50 people. The remaining 950, they immediately fade into the background. When you conceptualize this on a basic human level, 50 out of 1,000 is an incredibly narrow margin. It really highlights exactly how limited a linear, non-compounding approach actually is when you're dealing with massive sample sizes. And when we take that exact same 5% metric and scale it up globally, well, the mathematics paint a pretty stark picture. Out of roughly 64 million deaths per year across the globe, only about 3.2 million would be heaven-bound annually. This demonstrates what we can call the addition dilemma. When you factor in those booming birth rates we were just talking about, it becomes mathematically obvious that current mass evangelism tactics, which rely purely on simple addition, simply fail to keep up with global population growth. The math just doesn't bridge the gap. So, to change this outcome, we need a highly disruptive mathematical variable. We absolutely have to move away from simple addition and enter the realm of geometric progression. Now, in mathematics, this is basically a sequence where each term is found by multiplying the previous one by a fixed number, so it compounds over time. This right here is the absolute mathematical engine of our entire thought experiment. It's no longer about merely adding to a total, it's about the total itself becoming the multiplier. Watch how this compounding momentum works in practice, because it's wild. The model changes completely when individuals reproduce rather than just add. One believer helps one new person. Boom, now there are two. Those two turn around and do exactly the same thing, becoming 4, then 8, then 16, then 32. The pace accelerates rapidly. What starts as a seemingly slow one-on-one interaction suddenly begins to branch out exponentially, building this massive web of connections that grows larger and faster with every single cycle. But let's be intellectually honest for a second. 100% success rate in human behavior? Yeah, that's just not realistic. People aren't algorithms. So what if we assume a far more conservative rate? What if each Christian in the network successfully reaches only 0.3 people per year instead of a full person? Even with that dramatically reduced metric, adjusting for all the realities of human friction and delay, it still produces a incredibly steady, compounding 30% annual growth rate. So how does this new conservative growth rate interact with the real world? Well, we have two contrasting forces at play. We have the overall global population growing at approximately 0.9% annually. Against that, our conservative disciple multiplication model is growing at 30%. You can literally feel the analytical tension building here. Even playing it safe, intentional multiplication is growing at a rate significantly faster than natural human reproduction. That gap is rapidly closing. And this brilliantly illustrates the long-term compound effect. We begin at year zero with our baseline of 410 million. Maintaining that very realistic 30% annual multiplication rate, the curve quietly starts to accelerate. By year 5, the network hits 1.48 billion. By year 10, it crosses 5 billion. And then, here's the climax of the data. Right around year 12, the geometric progression reaches 8.96 billion, entirely overtaking the 8.2 billion global population. Just think about that time frame for a second. In just over a single decade, the mathematical model of compounding behavior completely catches up to the entire human race. No way, right? But that's the math. This brings us to a really profound strategic contrast in how impact is actually generated. Addition relies on mass proclamation. Think of a single prominent speaker in a massive stadium broadcasting a message to millions at a time. It's powerful for sure, and it's highly visible, but it's ultimately a single source that's completely bottlenecked by its own capacity. Multiplication, however, relies on decentralized discipleship. Instead of one person trying to reach many, it relies on a vast, interconnected matrix of everyday people, each taking responsibility for reaching just one. It scales infinitely because the capacity expands with every new person added to the network. Let's move to and see how this builds against the absolute human metric of mortality, because the results are staggering. The expanding decentralized network sequentially outpaces global mortality thresholds. First, it hits phase 1, covering 20% of annual global deaths. Then, as the compounding effect really takes hold, it scales to phase 2, meaning 50%, and eventually it reaches phase 3, where a full 100% of global annual deaths are met by the network. And the crazy part? This isn't achieved by organizing larger mass events or just shouting louder. It's achieved through quiet, everyday, consistent multiplication happening everywhere at once. Stepping back from the raw data for a moment, this leaves us with an incredibly powerful analytical paradigm: scaled behavioral impact. Now look, human decisions, cultural shifts, and personal faith, they are deeply complex. They aren't pure, sterile math, and we obviously cannot perfectly predict the future. However, the strategic power revealed in this thought experiment is absolutely undeniable. The core thesis is simply this: small, consistent actions, when repeated faithfully by millions of individuals, yield extraordinary, world-altering outcomes. Now, before we wrap up, it is absolutely crucial for our analytical credibility that we frame this correctly. This presentation is strictly a mathematical model based on numerical assumptions for educational and strategic modeling purposes. Actual religious affiliation shifts, micro-conversion factors, authentic lifelong discipleship outcomes, changing demographic trends, and highly individual personal faith decisions are significantly more complex and cannot be predicted with absolute mathematical certainty. We're looking at the math of what's possible here, not staring into a crystal ball of what will automatically happen. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought: one person, 1 year, one disciple. What actually happens when one believer reaches just one person and that person reaches another? The mathematical inevitability is clear. The greatest force for changing the world isn't addition, it's reproduction. It really makes you rethink everything you know about scale, doesn't it? Thank you so much for exploring this thought experiment with me today. Keep asking big questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.